Is the government secretly tracking journalists covering migrants at the southern border? That's what a local investigative report shows. Removing scofflaw tenants from your property is harder than you think. We take an in-depth look at how squatters are dealt with. And 2 local school districts announce staff layoffs. Why the districts say cuts are necessary. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Mari Payton, an investigative journalist with NBC7 San Diego, Kristen Taketa from the San Diego Union Tribune, and reporter Peter Rowe, also with the Union Tribune. Well, national attention this week is focused on a story by NBC7 Investigates about how the government is tracking journalists and others working with the migrant caravans of asylum seekers. And Mara, the opening of your story lays it all out, and we're going to hear that right now.
In December 2018, a migrant caravan from Honduras was heading toward the Tijuana-San Diego border. While those migrants made their way toward the San Ysidro port of entry, so did immigration advocates, attorneys, and journalists, including freelance photojournalist Arianna Dressler.
I shoot wide a lot, but I do shoot a lot of portraits.
Dressler estimated she had crossed the border from San Ysidro dozens of times for work.
I was very transparent about what I was doing. If I was asked by an agent what was I doing, I would tell them I was photographing at the shelters.
But in the month that followed her coverage of the caravan, Dressler said she and other journalists became targets of intense inspections. Some of them told NBC7 Investigates they suspected the U.S. government was monitoring them closely.
All right, and Mari, let's start right there. The first question, how'd you get onto this story?
Okay, so a source with Homeland Security actually came to us and said that he had some information that was important and that was troubling for that person. And so basically what it was were screenshots of a database. And the database included 59 journalists, advocates, an attorney. And on that were some pretty detailed information.
Okay, and so the database shows, let's go back to this photojournalist, for example. Tell us who she is and specifically what happened to her.
Yeah, Arianna Dressler, she's worked in San Diego. Some of you guys might even recognize her work. She's a great photojournalist, and she was working as a freelancer. So she wasn't tied to any one agency. Eventually, she ended up covering the caravan for BuzzFeed and UPI, and she was shooting photos all throughout 2018. Suddenly, at the end of 2018, she was going in for secondary questioning, basically.
That is, she's coming back through the border to the U.S.
Correct.
And instead of saying, okay, you're fine after checking the info, and so many of us have done that, they say, over here, we're going to look closer.
Exactly. And it didn't just happen one time, it actually happened 3 times. This was following, in November, if you'll recall, there was sort of violence had erupted at the border. Tear gas was used. Everyone kind of remembers that scene. And so following that incident in December, she was called in for secondary questioning, and then 2 more times in January. Not only were they asking her questions about why she was there, which is pretty standard procedure, but they asked to look at some of her photographs. In one instance, she was asked to separate from her cell phone, from her gear, which made her feel uncomfortable. And she didn't know anything about the database, but maybe suspected that they were tracking her, that they were keeping tabs on her because of all this questioning that was going on. And then we came to her with this sort of smoking gun, if you will.
Yeah, with the documents that you'd gotten. So a lot of folks, as you say, had been suspicious because of this secondary questioning and a lot of this unusual behavior by the border officials as they went through the border here. And this kind of confirms it all now.
Right. So a lot of people have reported about the secondary questioning, but I think it really ramped up in December, January, even last month. And so people sort of have been talking about it. Other news agencies have reported on it, but this was sort of the first proof that we had that it was going on. Yes, the U.S. government was keeping this database on some of these people, private citizens, we have to remember. And it wasn't just Customs and Border Protection that had access to it. It was the San Diego sector of the FBI, Department of Homeland Security. Okay.
And the Homeland Security source said that this is not what they're supposed to do. They have policies against creating dossiers and backgrounds on people. Right?
I mean, he called it an abuse of border search authority. he was obviously alarmed enough to do something about it.
Right.
And so it just felt like it wasn't what their agency was meant to be doing.
All right, Governor Gavin Newsom was at San Ysidro visiting down here yesterday, and we got a bite from him on this topic.
The irony of that shouldn't be lost on anyone, that we have better data collection against journalists than we do children and parents.
That's right.
You can't make that up. I mean, you heard the testimony yesterday, and apparently we don't collect data on children's separation, and yet the courts have to do it. And we found out 471 parents have been removed from their children, and yet we have deep data collection on all of you. That's America in 2019. It's a disgrace. It's disconcerting. Talk about Big Brother. I mean, it manifests so many fears. Of course, for everyone in the community, those fears have been manifesting all their lives. They see that every single day. In some ways, this may be a breakthrough when journalism is impacted, and maybe all of a sudden that will change some of the hearts and minds of the folks that are making some of the big decisions about what we put on the news every single night. And in some perverse way, this could be a good thing.
All right, so we hear from the California governor. You've gotten some other response here just today, have you not?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, we haven't even yet to report this, basically, but the different senators, and yesterday, it was actually, we should start with yesterday, House Democrats demanding that the Customs and Border Protection hand over the database and then answer a number of questions. Their deadline to do so is March 14th. Then come today, just a few minutes actually before I came on this show, there was a letter written by Senator Blumenthal to Secretary Nielsen, sort of demanding some of the same things, but also wanting to know which officials within the department were involved. And they also have a deadline in March a little bit later.
Okay. Pete?
So far, there's been no official response, though, right? They haven't responded to these requests, right?
Well, they wouldn't go on camera, right? The Customs and Border Patrol.
So
what did they say?
So they actually, last Friday, they sort of gave a generic statement defending the practice of needing to gather information from people that were tied to the caravan, possibly labeled as instigators. If you look at the cover letter of the database, it says something about tracking organizers, instigators, and the media. So they sort of defended the practice in general terms, but then right before we went to air and we broke this story earlier this week, they said that all of these people have a connection to the November incident that happened, which we have found not to be true. We've interviewed at this point about half of the people on the database, and some of them say they weren't even there when that happened. So we're still trying to find that connection between all of them.
So
if there is one.
Yeah, okay. Now, ACLU, human rights attorneys, of course, what do they have to say about this practice?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're calling it a First Amendment disaster. They're calling it unconstitutional. So they, at this point, have not issued, as far as I know, any legal action, but say they'll explore all options available.
Okay, and as you said, we may be hearing from Congress on this as well, and see what sort of questioning they come up with. You mentioned that the Committee to Protect Journalists last fall issued a report. It's obviously still going on from your reporting here, and perhaps it's expanded. What sort of response are you getting from the general public? What are people saying after your story is there?
I mean, as you can imagine, people sort of on both sides. Some people saying it was an outrage, goes against the First Amendment. Why are they tracking private citizens? This is documentation of that. And then, of course, you have people that say, well, this is what our government should be doing. There's a national crisis at the border, if you will, and that this is what has to be done. So, I mean, it definitely is bringing up a lot of emotion on all sides of the issue, if you will. And I really think that's why people are, spending so much time and focus on this story.
Now, have the journalists you've talked to say it's affecting how they do their jobs, or is it, I mean, it seems like it might have a chilling effect on certain individuals.
Right. So another journalist, not Arianna, but another journalist we spoke with, actually, she's worked for National Geographic, and she's a photographer as well. And she said she was actually flying from Montreal through Detroit to Mexico City. And she was there, and all of a sudden she was questioned in Canada, again in Detroit. And then once she got to Mexico City, questioned for hours, then turned back around. And since then, she has not been able to go back into Mexico for work. So, of course, I mean, especially if you're a freelance, photojournalist or a reporter, if you will, a writer, this really affects your work because you're working from story to story, case by case. You're getting a salary from someone. So this is really affecting people.
It's cutting your work off.
Exactly.
One last question before we move on. You mentioned that journalist in Mexico City. Mexican government is cooperating somewhat with the folks on the U.S. side, and they're stopping folks going into and more questioning into Mexico that way, going south.
Yeah, again, if you look at that screenshot of the cover of this report, you'll see the American flag and the Mexican flag. So we were sort of questioning what involvement the Mexican government had in all of this. They issued a statement yesterday, and basically what they said is they denied that they were doing any sort of illegal activity, that they were spying on people, but they also said they had their own questions for the Department of Homeland Security, and they would be looking into it as well.
All right, terrific reporting. We'll be looking for your follow-ups and what happens on the congressional side in Washington. We're going to move on. Our second story drew attention because of the famous name involved, the late Tony Gwynn, San Diego's beloved Mr. Padre. Tony Gwynn died of cancer in 2014. Last year, his $2.3 million Poway home was lost to foreclosure, and that brought news it was not empty but occupied by a squatter. And Pete, pick up the story there. This intruder kind of got you wondering what's going on. How rare is this?
Yeah, well, J. Harry Jones and Phil Molnar, reporters at the Union Tribune, did the story, and they spoke to sheriff's deputies about, why this guy was in the house. And the sheriff's deputy's response was curious. He said, hey, listen, we have to follow the process here. So the story was, well, what is that process? What happens when there's a squatter in your house? And it's really quite involved. Yeah. If you are a homeowner and someone is in your property without your permission, there is a very long process that you go through legally to get someone out.
You can't just walk in and say, hey, get the heck out of here.
Well, you can do that, but that opens you up to legal jeopardy. You could be sued. I heard some people talk about black bag evictions, where you take these black hefty bags, you go in, you grab the tenant's possessions, throw them in the bag, and toss them out on the sidewalk and say, there you go. But then you can be sued for, illegally evicting them.
Now, there's kind of two tracks as I read your story here. The hook was this situation where you have an empty house going to be shown by realtors and all, and realtors are reluctant to really talk about this, that right. People can go around maybe to see empty houses and hang out there for a few days. That's one situation, but that's rather rare.
A few days, or there's one famous case. There's a woman who kind of roams La Jolla in a late model Lexus, and she does this as kind of a day spa. She'll show up just for a couple of hours in a really nice house that's empty, go swimming or take a nap or just kind of hang out and then leave. But then there are others who kind of move in and try and make it more of a residence.
Get everything but a pedicure there on that one. That's great. Well, let's talk about that other track, which is you've got tenants. Suddenly they're not paying the rent. You started your anecdote with Carrie and Scott Packard, rented their home out in Carlsbad. They were out of the country for a time. Right. Things looked good at the beginning, and then what happened?
Yeah, so the Packards are off in Germany. Scott Packard had a job there. So they rented their house out. It's a nice, I think, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, kind of a standard Carlsbad home. So they rented it to this professional couple. They look good on paper. And initially, they started with late payments. And then after that, they were partial payments. And then the last 6 months they were there were no payments whatsoever. So they came home thinking that they would move into their place, and they found that legally they couldn't do that. Yeah. That they had to follow this process that was going to take them anywhere from, maybe 2 weeks to 24 weeks.
And it's happening so often. There's a whole Superior Court department dedicated basically to this whole squatter-tenant dispute situation.
Yeah, I was surprised to find that. It's Department 60 in Superior Court. And when you go there, there's a morning and an afternoon calendar, just like every other department. But they'll have, maybe 20 or 30 cases in the morning and 20 or 30 in the afternoon. Most of these are very fast. The cases, by the time it gets to court, things have been hashed out. Usually there's not even a trial. Usually the judge is just, hearing that they've come to a settlement, fine, bam, on to the next case. It did sit in on one trial, went for all of 25 minutes. Evidence was presented. There were a couple of witnesses, and as happens in something like 95% of the cases, the judge found for the property owner.
And there's somewhat on the other side of this. Didn't you learn in court that sometimes the tenants have some beefs themselves? That,
yes.
Explain how that might come.
And actually, I mean, I've been a landlord and I've been a tenant, and I've had good tenants and I've had bad landlords. I mean, you know, these things happen. And there are times, you know, when a tenant really needs, you know, these laws to protect them from, you know, abusive landlords who don't provide a safe dwelling place, who don't provide a clean place, you know, let bugs and roaches infest the place. So it's important to have these laws in place.
So they got a beef too. Now the backdrop of kind of the river running through your story, of course, is our housing crisis, the incredible cost of renting here. You think if the economy goes south again, which inevitably it will at some point, we expect this whole phenomenon to grow, the whole squatting situation?
Yes. I mean, that's the simple answer is yes. And the realtors who did talk to me say this rises and falls. I mean, right now we've got, you know, literally hundreds of cases every month, you know, in that Department 60.
In a good economy.
In a good economy. But you see these cases take off whenever there's a recession.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's
Can I ask one
yes,
more
please
question?
do.
Please,
What
yeah.
happened to the Carlsbad family? What happened to the couple?
Okay, so the Carlsbad family, they were so frustrated. They went through the first step, which was to write the letter of demand and mail it to their tenant's last known address, which of course was
Their own
address, right? And then these people had up to 18 days to respond. They never responded. They went back and checked, and they'd cleared out. So they had short-circuited the process just by moving out, which does happen, right? Yeah. But other folks say you have to be really prepared for the long run. It may take you months to get your place.
And then can they take legal action once they're out of the home? I mean, what's the course for any? I mean, you said that they weren't paying rent for months.
How far do you want to go with it?
Yes, they can. However, when they move back in, if they find that the tenants had left any property, they're legally responsible to safeguard that property for 2 weeks. If they just toss the property out, they can be sued for damages.
Mari, you don't ever want to be a landlord. It sounds like
Yes, no, not in that situation at least.
All right, we are going to move on. It's a great story. Well, here we go again. 2 school districts this week announced layoffs. They blamed it on budget shortfalls, a common refrain for many districts a few years back. Staff cuts are planned at San Diego Unified and at Sweetwater Union High School District. Let's begin with San Diego Unified. Tuesday night, the board voted 4-1 to approve layoffs, job eliminations. Here's what Superintendent Cindy Martin had to say.
The elimination of the positions is never an easy decision, as we know. However, in order to ensure the district maintains its strong fiscal position in the coming school year, we must work with within our limited means. Some of the eliminations within this item tonight are a result of central office department and school level decisions based on the needs of our students. Other eliminations are due to the end of grant funding.
All right, and Kristen, staff members insist, though, there's not really a lack of funding. What's their argument?
I think what they're feeling right now is largely frustration about just the fact that there will be eliminations of positions. There is a lack of funding. Like, there's going to be a $37 million expected shortfall was the latest number that the district has put out. So they are, and staff are always the biggest cost of any school district. It's more than 80% of their budget. So it's inevitable that if you have to make budget cuts, you have to cut staff in some way. But I think we saw at the meeting on Tuesday that there were staff who were upset that they were like either going to have libraries that weren't going to be staffed 5 days a week or barely 1 day a week in some cases, they said. So it's just there's going to be an impact on schools, but I don't think we know for sure yet what that's going to be.
All right, I want to get into that a little bit more in a second, but you've nicely set up our next bite here. It was an emotional meeting, and we heard from some folks who came up and spoke about it from the rank and file.
It is not okay that you're laying off 1, 2, 10, 15, 27, or 37. Going through this motion of moving papers and moving numbers. These are human beings that deserve to be respected on the job. And you have that duty. As elected officials, you have that duty. And I ask you to send your team back and do the work and figure out where the money is. Our students deserve better.
All right, very emotional, as we said there. So tell us what it's looking like right now. We're going to get into a minute how this whole process works, but what specific positions, how many are we talking about, different positions are involved at San Diego?
Yeah, so for sure the district has said that they're going to be laying off 33 certificated teachers in addition to 4 certificated administrators, and then there's going to be as many as about 65 or 66 classified positions that might be laid off as well. We're not sure yet exactly who will be laid off. The district has a couple months more to decide exactly who, but yeah, so those are the people we know could be affected.
And we should note that's out of a total number of employees about 10,000
roughly
in the San Diego,
10,000,
San Diego district. So the impact on students in the classroom down where the rubber meets the road, do we know exactly what that might be yet?
Yeah, so the positions that are being eliminated include like school health technicians, early childhood aides. So a lot of classroom aides were kind of on the table. But then there are also those 33 certificated positions include teachers, a number of foreign language teachers were included in that. And then the district has said that, or they've argued that they made sure to cut as according to needs. So they prioritized student needs when they were deciding who to cut.
All right. One school board member voted against it. What was his take on
Kevin Beiser. And it's interesting because he's a teacher currently, so he, I'd imagine maybe he might have been feeling the same or
frustrations
listening to the teachers' emotions. But I think he brought up an interesting point in that the district didn't, so they're saying while they're cutting these positions, they're also adding some dozens more positions, but the district didn't say what those positions are. So it's really kind of foggy. We don't know what's needed and we don't know what's being added. So
yeah, that's very confusing.
Yeah,
at this point.
It's really confusing. So the district will actually be talking more about their budget next week at their next board meeting, and they'll have a bigger picture of what their budget cuts are going to look like, but it's really
more to come, certainly. Let's shift over to the Sweetwater Union High District. They voted Saturday night, closed door meeting. Result of that vote, what are we looking at there?
Yeah, so they voted to release up to 87 administrators from their positions. So those people could be laid off, they could be assigned to different positions, but likely it'll include at least some layoffs, and that includes all of the district's 69 assistant principals, so it could have a pretty big impact on schools. Yeah,
sure could. Now, the deficit at the Sweetwater High District, what are the nuts and bolts on that?
Yeah, so actually, I just looked this morning. They've updated their numbers, so right now we're expecting to see about $22.5 million of budget cuts that they have to make for the next school year to make ends meet. So this is part of them trying to reduce their costs that way. Yeah.
And Sweetwater, of course, has been in the news. Sweetwater Union District enmeshed in scandal. Give us kind of the thumbnail on that. We've talked about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot, but
it is. But just quickly.
Yeah, sure. So basically, it was an agency found in December that they have been basically reporting incorrect information about their finances for years, and they've been underestimating expenditures. They've been borrowing money to make ends meet, and so. There's a lot of internal controls that were lacking in their financial systems. So
okay, and that's still playing out as well.
Yeah.
All right, we got almost out of time here, but we touched on this earlier. This still has to play out over a few months because you got to get the governor's budget, the reconciliation of that. The numbers really come into sharper focus down the road, don't they?
Yeah, they will. Districts won't finalize their budgets until June, so they still have that time, and then we still don't know exactly what the state is going to give them in terms of money.
And for example, last year, some pink slips went out, and they have to go out. They have to warn folks you may get laid off, but the numbers were pared back, right? In San Diego, for example.
Yeah, they actually only laid off less than half of what they were originally, what they originally sent out pink slips to. Yeah, so they will either resignations or retirements help reduce those numbers.
Yeah, so attrition comes into this, and all the numbers will be crystallized after a while. Well, we are, as I say, about out of time, but we had these stories so much more in the news 10 years ago when the economy was going south, and as I mentioned with Pete's story on the housing, I imagine if the economy goes south, we can expect these happening more and more. Well, fascinating stuff. We'll look for your follow-up reporting on that. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guest, Kristen Takata and Peter Rowe of the San Diego Union Tribune. You're both together on this side, and Mary Payton of NBC7 Investigates. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for being with us today, and join us again next Friday on the Roundtable.